Well, hello and welcome to everyone. We're delighted you're here to join us for part 3 of our 2022 webinar series, Possibilities and Practicalities of Cloud Adoption in Life Sciences. My name is Pauline O'Riordan, and I'm a head of product and strategy at Odyssey VC. I'll be your host for today and hosting part 3. So those who maybe joined previously will know how this goes, but part 3, so today we're discussing selecting fit for purpose cloud solutions and avoiding the pitfalls. So that's the theme of today's webinar. The life science industry is increasingly being drawn to the opportunities that cloud technologies can offer. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at how to choose right fit cloud solutions that will meet the compliance obligations and demands. We will discuss the expectations of regulated companies towards cloud technology vendors and how to satisfy the compliance obligations. And we will share some insights from some real world examples. We have a fabulous panel of experts today. So I'm going to introduce those for you now. So I'm going to welcome Mr. Finan Friel. Finan is Head of Business Solutions and co-founder at Odyssey VC. A warm welcome to Mr. Oisín Curran, CEO and also co-founder of Odyssey VC. Welcome. Joining us then is Mr. Tom McKittrick, Head of Customer Success at Odyssey. And our final introduction is Ms. Magdalena Villaro, a Quality Assurance and Compliance Lead at Odyssey. So welcome all and to the session today. I might just ask you to put on your cameras and unmute yourselves to maybe introduce yourselves to the people on the webinar.
Thanks for the introduction, Pauline, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today.
Great, and appreciate everybody attending.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. Looking forward to the panel discussion later on.
Brilliant. Okay, so then just let's have a pop into the agenda. So we will kick off proceedings with a presentation from Oisín, who will speak about cloud adoption and getting it right for life sciences. At the end of Oisín's presentation, we will have time for Q&A. So I really want to encourage you to engage with us through the Q&A functionality. So please do submit your questions and we'll gather those and ask them at the end of Oisín's presentation. Following on from that, then we will have Finan, and Finan will speak to us about cloud solutions, what the regulatory and guidance bodies are saying. And again, we'll have a time for some Q&A. And then we would have an open, follow up the presentations by an open panel discussion where Finan and Oisín will be joined by Tom and Magdalena. As always, please feel free to share our event on social media using the hashtags #OBCWebinar and our #OdysseyVC. And of course, make sure to follow us on our social media platforms. Okay, then we can get started. Just as I'm introducing the first speaker, I'd just like to run a quick poll. So hopefully you should see that poll pop up for you in a moment. And I'm going to welcome Mr. Oisín Curran. So Oisín is CEO and co-founder at Odyssey VC. Oisín has been working in life sciences for more than 2 decades. During this time, he has held leading roles in transforming life sciences across multiple business areas, including regulatory and compliance, digital and connected health. Oisín has extensive experience in life science applications, GXP cloud integration, and IoT and healthcare system deployment. So thanks, Oisín, and you're going to kick off our session with our first presentation. So
very good. Thanks very much, Pauline. I just want to share my own screen here.
Perfect.
Now just let me know you should be okay, yeah?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So
I'm going to let you take it away and I will mute myself here. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Pauline. So welcome everybody and thanks for joining us today. As Pauline says, this is part 3. So for those of you who missed the previous sections, we covered a lot of topics around general industry approach, macro drivers. I'm going to cover a little bit of that again today. But it's really the next phase is about, let's look at some real world solutions and the challenges that we're starting to see. So what I'm going to look at, and this is going to hopefully tie in nicely to Finon's side, but it's looking at some of the macro drivers, and it's something that I like to bring up with our customers, both life sciences customers and SaaS companies that are selling and providing solutions into life sciences customers as well. But looking at some of the macro drivers, because this is something which, in particular enterprise level, large life sciences customers, they may not see directly in a day-to-day basis, but the underlying industry itself is changing. How software and solutions are delivered is changing. And that may be, independent of our preference for a traditional purchase and our consumption model. So I'm going to cover that a little bit. I want to look a little bit at the regulatory position and why we should care about that and why we should care about what those drivers are. And that's going to, again, tie in with Finon's session, where he's going to look at a little bit of the underlying regulatory changes and positions on this. And then we're going to look at the adoption of, for those of you who are new to it, the XaaS is really to cover the consumption model, whether that be infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, depending on your entry point. But let's have a look at the considerations for the adoption of those solutions by life sciences companies. And then for those of you who are coming from the software vendor side who are on today's webinar, I want to actually have a little look at how you as a vendor can meet that challenge, because we see it as a real opportunity to differentiate ourselves as vendors or suppliers of solutions into life sciences as they're looking to innovate and change. So that's a little bit of a look at what I'm looking to cover today. So from the point of view of the macro perspective, and this is just to allow people to see that this is not a personal opinion. This is not an opinion of Odyssey or a number of vendors. This is a general industry position. That the adoption of digital, whether that be as part of a manufacturing process or as part of a supplier process, or how we look at the deployment of new digital solutions, that drive is happening regardless of whether we like it or not. And in some cases, companies that have executed large digital transformation models or strategies, they have seen new opportunity for new business segments. And we see that, for example, in digital twinning of manufacturing capacity. Sometimes if you're an automation engineer in a manufacturing plant, you may not see the value of digital transformation, but as a business, the ability to understand what's our manufacturing capacity, what is our manufacturing, our control envelope around our processes, that was a critical phase, for example, in the development and manufacture of COVID vaccines. It was all done on digital. And I think that's something for us all to be aware of. This is not just about maintaining what we did yesterday, it's about how we're going to deal with the business model of the future. So there's a lot of stats around this. And for those of you who have access to Gartner documentation, there's an ID for this particular document around life science organizations and what's driving their technology decisions. But I distilled it into these kind of 6 points, and it's really around the fact that the underlying dynamic of how life sciences researches, produces, and takes products to market is changing. There's a lot more pressure on pricing models for ultimate consumption at the patient end, but there's also a lot more interaction directly with the consumers of the products. And that's to do with, in some cases, it's the actual product itself. It may be a digital product, for example, utilizing smartphone apps for monitoring degradation of vision. So there's a number of those that exist on the market already as a pure digital product, but ultimately there's clinical decisions are made. But I think when we look at the consumer power that's driving the demand for digital interaction and digital solutions, it's something that is now pulling in the whole supply chain or life cycle of regulated products. So again, these are about the macro drivers. It may not be something that we feel is relevant to us, and if you're in manufacturing, if you're on the SaaS side, you will see it. But when you look at the footprint in terms of the industry, so in the middle, what we've got is a kind of a flow of the interaction of life sciences. So you got the core life sciences companies themselves. For those of you who are on today's webinar who are on the SaaS side or on the provider of technology, and this is the a key part of today is how do we actually provide solutions and the pitfalls associated with it. But you're going to find more and more demand from life sciences companies looking for your solutions, for example, as a validated software as a service deployment model. And we see that time and time again. And a lot of cases, SaaS vendors are caught out by that because they were never responsible for it. But connected health companies, by their very nature, have a lot of challenges in terms of data integrity and validation because devices naturally are worn in private premises or outside of controlled premises. And that's a real challenge in terms of data integrity. But those are drivers, for example, around clinical trials. There's a huge demand for connected health, connected devices in that space. But the two things I'd like to really draw attention on this slide is 95%, and this we'd see this represented on the ground with our life sciences customer base, are cloud first by this year. And every conversation we go into around digital solutions, whether that be pure automation in the manufacturing space, or whether it's a more business focused in the R&D or clinical trial space, everybody's first position is we're looking for a cloud deployment model. We're looking either for validated SaaS or platform as a service. So what that's driving is the underlying software vendors have to adapt to that. But it also means that the traditional on-prem deployment models for software is slowly been eroded. And if you're a life sciences customer who are on the call today, that's something to keep in mind, because it may be the case that in the very near future, you won't be able to purchase software in that traditional way, even if that's your preferable model. All of these things across those three segments, again, from a macro perspective, are really creating a cross-industry pool. So life sciences companies are looking to leverage more on good vendors. And this is something that Finnan's going to cover later, but this is part of our do's and don'ts of right fit technology in this case. And equally for connected health companies, because life sciences companies are trying to understand their R&D pipeline quicker, the data associated with their R&D execution quicker to facilitate market authorization for products. In some cases, connected health companies are leveraging platform as a service, for example, running in AWS and Azure and similar cloud platforms. And they ultimately are creating regulated records that need to be processed and are auditable and ultimately presented to the life sciences companies. So I mentioned that this is something which you covered in I think the last webinar, but I wanted to bring it up again in the context of the do's and don'ts, because we constantly come up against this position from as a service consumption models or as a service providers. And this is where people feel that because we're utilizing, big technology players, that should be sufficient. This is not just a standard technology play. And this is the one thing I'd like to get out of this slide is we have to be aware that when you're providing a as a service model to a life sciences customer that is creating, transmitting, storing, processing, or in any other way interacting with a regulated record, you are part of the data lifecycle of GXP records, of regulated records. And with that in mind, this is a direct response from the European Medicines Agency on the topic of leveraging. And the view is when you're using an XAS provider as a life sciences customer, you have to confirm, this is from the European Medicines Agency perspective, that Annex 11 has been fulfilled. So there's an entire life cycle associated with that. So just because it's an as a service model, it doesn't mean that you can ignore that. Essentially, what you do is you push a lot of the responsibility onto the provider. And that's point two. Utilizing providers, you have to be able to audit them. They are essentially a key part of the provision of your regulated record. And Finnan again is going to mention this later on in his view on CSA and the second edition of GAMP, which are critical guidance documents and regulatory documents in this space. But you have to be able to audit your vendors. And where that comes from, we get this a lot with cloud vendors. You get presented with a certificate. So I have an ISO 27001 or a SOC report, and that certificate is sufficient to take the place of a regulatory inspection or auditability. Now, there is wiggle room based on the risk profile of the application and the associated data, but you cannot make that assumption. And to be able to audit the vendors is in this case, is part of Annex 11. You have to be able to provide that evidence, and presenting a certificate is not fit for purpose. So that's again, not our opinion, that's coming direct from the regulatory bodies. So when we mentioned the topic of this particular webinar, we mentioned choosing right fit technologies. What I want to outline here is, and we're trying to represent it on the right-hand side in the little icons, but on the bottom, what we've got is the infrastructure as a service provider. In the middle, what you've got is the actual SaaS vendor and their coding practices, their development principles, and then on the top is the point of consumption. So, as I mentioned, if it's interacting with a GXP record, it has to be validated. And I think the expectations that regulated companies, again, to cover the intent of what we're trying to mention today, is that when regulated companies decide they want to go with a software as a service model, they're doing it for efficiency, for scalability, for cost effectiveness. But when they make that decision, they're pushing the responsibility of validation onto the SaaS vendor. So they must ensure that the SaaS vendor is compliant. And that's where they're going to have to audit you. They're going to have to make sure that you are capable of design, build, test, release, and managing a product that's compliant. And that takes us down into the app development and cloud environment structure. So as a SaaS vendor, we know, and we have a lot of customers that we deal with who are in the SaaS space or in the med device space, and they produce brilliant software, brilliant apps for niche use cases, whether it be in analytics or virtual reality or augmented reality or supply chain or document management. There's so many use cases in terms of software that are being produced day in, day out now. But the thing that software companies tend to miss out on is, if you're planning on going direct to market or through channel, but your target customer is a life sciences customer and you're going to be handling regulated records, there is an expectation that you will provide a validated application that's auditable, and that your infrastructure that runs on is qualified and auditable. That's because that's what your customer has to do. I think the SaaS vendors in this case, great processes, and we talk to a lot of them who have regulated customers who present big questionnaires, and I think this is part of the expectations again of the regulated customers. They present these desktop questionnaires, and there's a lot of questions that people kind of get concerned about quality and management, change management, and all of these topics. But as a SaaS vendor, you need to make sure that all of your product and your suppliers are auditable, because that's a prerequisite of entering into this market and dealing in this market. And that's not them being difficult. It's what they've had to do for themselves. They're looking to outsource this for scalability, for cost effectiveness, and all of those things. But as a SaaS vendor, you really need to make sure that you're able to do that. And then equally, sticking with the topic of what we're trying to cover today, and choosing right fit technologies, I think the key thing from a regulated customer perspective is you need to make sure that your vendors are aligned with the regulatory expectations. And there's a lot of our SaaS vendors that we deal with see it as a real competitive advantage. If you've covered this, and it's not a huge piece of work to make sure that your development practices are auditable, are open to inspection by your regulated customer, are architected correctly, you've got correct change, configuration management, and all of those things, but you're ultimately capable of producing the necessary evidence to demonstrate validation, that's a huge value proposition to your life sciences customer. So thinking about the life sciences customer for a second, we've got a couple of really interesting use cases lately where we've had regulated customers, they're looking for validated SaaS solutions, and the SaaS providers in general, they don't maintain that skill set in-house to be able to validate it. So I think making sure that you address the requirements of your industry, your target market, i.e. life sciences, early is going to be critical, because one of the things that happens with a lot of the SaaS companies that come to us, for example, is they say, I've just got this questionnaire, I need to be able to respond to it quickly. Can you just help us kind of cover over the cracks so that we can say yes to our questionnaires? But in a lot of cases, it's kind of too late at that stage, and you've got a lot of heavy lifting to do to correct your processes, create the evidence. We've had certain instances where regulated customers have an outsourced IT vendor, and they push the infrastructure as a service component out to them. So as a SaaS vendor, just be aware that they may not trust your ability to manage the data integrity of your infrastructure or your application. They might want to host that themselves or through their vendors. Now, again, sometimes the infrastructure vendors themselves are not capable of maintaining qualified infrastructure, and that's a challenge. And that's something which, as a SaaS vendor, you're completely capable of quizzing them on and making sure that your technology stack is able to run in a compliant fashion. And that takes me to the last point around the cloud providers. If you are providing a fully web-based SaaS tool, validated SaaS tool to your regulated customer, you have to make sure that the underlying infrastructure as a service is designed, built, and maintained in line with the regulatory expectations. And remember from the previous slide, that's not about presenting an AWS ISO 27001 cert. That's not appropriate. And there's a lot of gaps in terms of AWS and the large commodity vendors and how they provide that. But again, once you understand the risk profile of what you're doing, what your application is doing, you need to be conscious of that. But I would advise or suggest, if you're designing applications from the ground up, that you consider them as containerized solutions or pure cloud native solutions from day one, because you'll get better portability. So if your customer says, I really like your product and you need to make a sale, the customer wants validated SaaS, but they don't want it on public AWS running in the US, they want it in Europe for GDPR reasons, you'll have a much easier capability to port it over. So that's something to keep in mind. This slide is really geared towards the SaaS vendors, right? And what I'd say is, for validated cloud applications, if you're targeting life sciences, just make sure that you're aware of the compliance overhead. It is a competitive advantage for SaaS vendors. We see that day in, day out. Make sure that you're auditable, your business processes, quality systems are transparent and easy to follow. It'll make it easier for your customer to buy off you. I think presenting the structure of your QMS in an auditable fashion quickly and in a clear and concise fashion, it reduces the adoption time. And we all know, if you're a SaaS vendor, the cycle time between somebody interested in your product and actually getting it to them can be the difference between somebody adopting it or not. So the faster you can do that, the better. And this is a prerequisite for that. And from a life sciences customer perspective, again, for those who are on today's webinar, the speed at which your SaaS vendor can reply to these should be an indication of how ready they are to meet the expectations of this business. So that's something which we see, because again, we get contacted by SaaS companies in the back after they get these questionnaires and they're struggling to respond to them, and that creates a delay. So that's just something to keep in mind, is time to response around this. If for SaaS vendors, how you develop, deploy and manage your application and your cloud and your pipelines, you need to have a clear software development lifecycle, or SDLC, because that's the basis on which you can then demonstrate how it's controlled and how it's maintained. And that comes under your organization quality controls. It shouldn't be an afterthought. Most software vendors start with small dev teams, or even when they're large, they still have outsourced teams. Make sure you have a clear vendor management process. We've got audited on this very thing recently in terms of security and security stack associated with infrastructure as a service. You need to be able to make sure that you have a clear way of managing your vendors, that you know who's doing what, where, when, and why they're doing it. On the cloud side, and Odyssey has a product in the market that's designed specifically for the niche use case where pure public cloud is not appropriate, and somebody in the life sciences sector needs fully validated, fully qualified, dedicated architecture. And the reason I'm saying that is not all infrastructure is made equal. So just because you got access to a great tool that's publicly available on a per transaction basis in Amazon or Azure, we know this, that a lot of life sciences companies will require qualified private cloud. They will ask for it. And that's why I'm saying, in the do's and don'ts, you might consider a pure native cloud architecture. Make sure it's, for example, containerized and it's portable across security stacks and across technology stacks. The security stack is definitely a competitive advantage if you're a SaaS vendor. Data integrity is the critical part of the life cycle of what your customer as a regulated customer is responsible for. So again, when we get audited around our technology stack, the IT and security and cybersecurity functions of our life sciences customers go really, really in depth on this particular point, to understand exactly how you're protecting their data, how you're managing access to it, how you're managing encryption in transit, encryption at the database level. There's a lot that's involved in that, but we see it as a competitive advantage. So in terms of the do's and don'ts as a SaaS vendor, think about the life sciences company's expectations, and then make sure that compliance isn't just one of those things that's responsibility of the quality function. Try and build it in, because it makes it easier to actually meet the expectations of your customer. But see these as competitive advantages, because we know from the macro drivers that I mentioned earlier on that the overall industry has been driven to consume software as a service. That's not going to be for every single case. Manufacturers are still going to require technology on the floor to manufacture products, but everybody's interested in the data, what we can gain from it in terms of knowledge. The business is trying to understand capability across manufacturing and supply chains. They're all very, very data hungry and trying to get data back up into the higher level. So you're going to have to figure out ways of doing that. And that's where there's a lot of disruptive technology, and SaaS companies are, for example, they're disrupting the traditional big players, be it SAP, Oracle, the big technology vendors on the manufacturing side. And that's going to continue, because again, people are after cost efficiency and scalability as well. So that's it from my side. I think what I'd say is there's a huge opportunity. If you're a SaaS vendor here, there is a huge opportunity to gain competitive advantage if your target market is only or is partially life sciences. You got customers who need solutions quicker. They want validated SaaS. They tend to be quite sticky, and this is a very important point, I suppose, for life sciences customers, is how to transition to new vendors. But there's a cost to doing it. So I'd say, this is a really attractive space. As you see, there's a lot of opportunity for growth and adoption here. So just keep in mind those pitfalls, and make sure from a do's and don'ts, it's not just about the technology, it's about the technology and who's consuming it, which is a regulated customer here. You need to be aware of their demands. So that's it from me, Pauline.
Great, Oisín, thank you so much. And yeah, great insight. I particularly like the point you made about time to response, to be honest with you, because as a regulated company, if you've asked a SaaS vendor, to respond, I think it is an indication of whether they're able to or not, the length of time it does take, because if you have thought in advance about your customers' regulatory needs in particular, you're at the ready and you've built it in. And so it's very good advice for SaaS companies just to build it into your design if you have the life sciences or regulated industry on your radar for entering. Thanks so much, Oisín. There was just a couple of questions that came through as you were speaking, so I'm going to present them to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So the first question in, Oisín, was what would you say are the key qualities a SaaS provider needs to have to be successful in life sciences?
What the key qualities, I think the first thing is really about understanding your customers' needs, is an empathy towards that, because I think what you've got is a customer with a very specific set of requirements around how solutions are delivered. And that's not just them trying to be difficult or to create barriers to entry. It's part of doing business for them. Yeah. So you've got a real desire here to look for new innovative solutions. There's a real interest to innovate and execute digital transformation programs. But it just makes it so much easier if the supplier on the end of the phone says, I totally understand your needs for either a technical need, whether it be integration, or whether, in this case, whether it's compliance. I totally understand the need for validation. We have that covered in this particular way, and we can show you all of that. I think that the ability to be that transparent, I think, is a really, really important point.
Yeah, and a real advantage, I suppose, competitively.
Yeah.
And the other question that came in was, it says, I work in pharma. We are unsure about using cloud technologies due to the perceived increased risk for us, especially around the area of control. What key advice would you give us to help lessen our fears?
There's probably two parts to that. Firstly, I think if you don't think you're using cloud already, you probably want to address that, because you already are. Your organization probably is. You're using, for example, Office 365. That's a pure cloud service. So they're in your business already. The risk is how you use it and how you control it. So what I'd say is there's two sides. One is just do the due diligence in terms of the provider you choose, whatever that solution may be. Conduct the audits, ask the questions. As we said, you can issue a desktop questionnaire, which isn't a big piece of work for you as a regulated customer. And if it takes 2 months to get that back, that's what we see sometimes that as an indication of the level of structure that they've got in place. And secondly, this is about technical performance as well. Get your technical team or your technical consultant in, whoever that is, to determine what type of service are you getting. Because in a lot of cases you say, yes, this is a SaaS service, but it's pure multi-tenanted, it's globally deployed, so it's not retained in jurisdiction. There's all sorts of things technically that could present a business risk as in addition to the compliance risk. So conduct your due diligence, get it technically assessed, but I would say leverage cloud. There's so many good solutions, cost effective. We know they're cost effective because a lot of the big suppliers have had a stranglehold on the business for so long. I think that there's a great opportunity to leverage really good vendors on the cloud side.